Recruiting volunteers at church often goes poorly.
Churches appear desperate, and volunteers often feel guilted into serving.
There are, of course, short-term measures that you can take to recruit volunteers, but typically those do not translate to long-term success.
So to do this right, there are 3 stages we need to talk about: how to recruit, how to train, and how to celebrate.
And we promise any church can do this. In fact, there are a few specific techniques that, when done right, end up doing so much of the heavy lifting for you.
Let's dive in.
Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shearer, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host, it's Bishop Border Crossing, Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
And here's the big idea for this episode. It's not what you're going to want to hear, church leader. It's more work now for less work forever afterwards. I get it. It's not something you want to go into a podcast hearing, but what we see very often when it comes to this monumental task that never seems to end and always seems to be in need at church, recruiting volunteers, is we take some shortcuts and we go about it in ways that we see short-term yield, short-term returns, but in the long term, we're actually not making any ground, and we're not building the culture, and we're not actually empowering people to do things which then allow us as on-staff leaders, pastors, to do what we do best. So we're going to talk about 3 different stages. We're going to talk how to recruit, how to train, and how to celebrate.
And you're talking about something, you said it already, something that is evergreen in the church world is the need for volunteers, and so by extension, recruiting new volunteers. And we all feel it. It's just this constant pain point. You know, the familiar phrase I hear from folks who work in churches, it's like pulling teeth. And if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, you know that we like a framework, maybe a 3-step framework.
Love it.
Policy. And
Big fan.
We talk in these ways because by installing a framework or a set of values or policies, you have structure for setting you up for success for the future. And that's really what we need here is a rhythm, a structure, a framework to recruit volunteers on an ongoing basis because you're always going to need them.
Think about it like finances. Nobody wants to save money. We want to spend money.
That's right.
But if you save money and you do that work up front, in the long term, things are way better for you.
You'll have money to spend.
If you spend it all, things are way worse in the
That's
long
right.
term, but it felt good in the short term. And here is the cardinal rule for both finances, but also for volunteers.
Yeah.
You can only withdraw after a deposit. And when churches do ministry fairs and they do announcements from stage and they're like, hey, we want to get people involved, it's usually because they're like, we're already overdraft and we desperately are in need. So we need to kind of paradoxically approach this from the opposite end of the spectrum. And there is a specific social post, in fact, that I think is really useful in this way. And we highlighted this on a recent episode of Pro Church Tools Inc. That video title was 3 must-try social media posts for smaller churches. And this social post, which you can see on the screen if you're watching on YouTube, is very simple if you're listening to understand. There is a greeter, and that greeter is mic'd up. And there is a person filming what this greeter is doing on a Sunday morning.
From a distance, like long lens style, kind of like candid camera.
Right. Yeah. And so you're like seeing in real time a compilation, a montage of what it was like for that volunteer to serve in ministry.
It's so good.
On that
This
day.
post is awesome.
And we found a couple versions of this. And when we posted about it on YouTube and Instagram, I got a bunch of DMs from churches that said like, oh yeah, we've done this and everybody loves it. And sometimes these posts go viral, but sometimes like just people in the church love it. And it is useful in so many different arenas. In fact, I think it's very useful in recruiting volunteers.
And it works as it's like indirect recruitment.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And that's why you can only withdraw after a deposit. This is the deposit because it's a culture builder. And there are a few reasons why I think this is incredibly effective. And it's the type of thing that, yes, you can post on social, but run this during service as well. You know, we play mini movies, we play transition types of things on the screen in service. This is a great recurring segment that you could do. And there are a bunch of different ministries that you can highlight. So do kids ministry, do greeters, do people at the cafe, do people at the welcome desk, do ushers, do people that are giving, and just watch them count the money and whatever it might be. The reason that this is useful, number of reasons why. There was one specific study that I found very interesting, published in the Cambridge Press in 2008. And what it demonstrated, it was called Social Pressure and Voter Turnout. What it demonstrated is that there's really only one way we know, proven, to get more people to vote. And the way to do it is if people that live near you knew if you voted or not.
Huh.
Not like reveal who you voted for, but like just imagine a big X across your door if you didn't vote. If people know you're not voting, we are compelled to vote. There's this social pressure. And I think that in a positive way, this social post accomplishes the same feat, because what it does is you see people serving. And if you show this, do it for 4 weeks in a row of different ministries. And what you've done is over the course of that month, you started to build culture in your church. It's like, hey, we are a church that volunteers. And we don't just say that, like we're showing you. And that's the other power of this post.
Yeah.
Show, don't tell.
Yeah.
All we do typically when we are recruiting volunteers is tell. It's tell, tell, tell. There is no show whatsoever. And then we ask ourselves, why was this not compelling, right? You want to get to the point where people feel like they get to volunteer, not where they're guilted to volunteer. And so many of us are living in that latter space where we're guilting people into volunteering. And that's why it's this short-term thing, because it doesn't work in the long term, because these people aren't actually motivated to do well, or they're not motivated to stick around. So imagine I'm Brady and I'm sitting in service, and Alex is not a pastor in this hypothetical. Alex is also with me, and we go to church together normally. And he's up there, and he's in that greeter video. And I think to myself, oh, Alex is serving. I'm not serving. Oh, and I don't think much of it. But then next week, I see somebody else I recognize, and they're in kids ministry, and they're serving. And then the week after, I see someone in worship ministry, and they're serving. The week after, it's somebody in sound ministry. And I see this week after week, and I'm just starting to have like this culture. I'm starting to like be absorbed by the culture of this church. Oh, okay, all these people are serving. And what it's also doing is it's showing me what they're doing.
That's
the
right.
difficulty of making the announcement, hey, we need kids ministry volunteers. Like, yeah, I was in kids ministry like 30 years ago.
Right.
I don't really remember what that's like. When you see it, you're like, I could do that. Oh, wow, that's fun. Because you're not only showing it, you're showing it in an exciting way.
Exactly.
And now it starts to be like, this is our culture. I know exactly what you're wanting from me, clear expectations, and it looks fun and exciting. I don't want to be the one left out. Everyone's doing this. I don't want to be the one that doesn't show up and vote.
I love the idea of taking this social post, because that's how we highlighted it a few weeks ago on the show, was showing it as a social post. But the idea you've brought, Braid, of like showing it on the screen during service or pre-service, doing it as like a sprint promotion for 4 weeks at a time, or doing it as a sprinkle promotion, maybe showing this, once a quarter or something. I think that's so great, because what it does is, like you said, not only does it plant seeds of culture and like build culture, but it reveals the culture that's like already happening in the church that maybe not everyone is aware of. So
Reveals,
the kids ministry is a perfect example, because if you're not currently volunteering in kids ministry, or you don't have kids, you don't know what goes on behind those closed doors, because like you're not in there. And so the kids leave service, and you know that there's teachers out there, but you don't really know what it looks like because you're not a part of it. So to bring that into the main worship space and show it, reveal that culture, it's like, oh, I had no idea that that's what our kids leaders do. And now that I'm seeing that, either that excites me, or I know that deep down within me, there's like a gift to do that as well. And so you kind of get to pull back the curtains and show like, this is what goes on in our church. And to the original social posts we're talking about, like, welcoming people to church can be a lot of fun. That video does a great job of showing how much fun it is. And so just by simply sharing this video of what's going on, you're not scripting anything. You're just showing what it's like to be a volunteer at this church. You've done a great job of making the case for how fulfilling it can be to volunteer, and how important volunteers are to the community and the culture of the church.
So let's just repeat how powerful this type of campaign can do. And I would suggest run it for 4 to 6 weeks and do a different one each week. This will give you a new social post every single week.
Yeah.
It'll give you a new element to play in service every single week. It will build your culture with the show, don't tell communication philosophy. You are demonstrating this is who we are as a church. We're not just talking about it from stage. We're not just claiming this. We are showing you. What it's also going to do is it will avoid any air of desperation when you do ask for volunteers. Because the way I would probably do this is I would have that video run, let's say before the announcements in church, and then during announcements, I would say, hey, if you want to be just like Lewis and join the greeter team, and then I would lay out expectations, like here's what we're looking for. Because this is another thing that we do poorly when we're recruiting volunteers. We don't make the expectations clear. When you show that video, you now have a real example. You have a source that you can anchor to when you talk about what's needed. And then in the announcement, you can get into specifics. We're looking for people to serve once a month. It's going to take this much time. You can talk about the video. This is what's like required of you.
Yep.
And now you have an actual ask a withdraw, but it's coming after the deposit. The reason the withdrawals don't work is because you're already overdraft,
Right.
and you're pulling, and you're appearing desperate, and like who wants to like sign up for something like that? And the reason why it turns out that it's one person that's like volunteering, 20% of people doing all the work in church is because those are the people that are like, you know what, I'm just a very good human at heart, and I'm willing to do this. I'm going to step up. But the other people are not because the expectations aren't clear. It's kind of a black box. I don't really know what you're asking of me, so like it's easy for me to say no because like I'm just going to assume that you're asking things that I can't do. And also, you know, this is just like seems desperate from stage. Like I don't really want to be part of something like that. Like I've got other responsibilities. I want to be part of something exciting. This can work wonders. What it also lays the groundwork for in terms of how to recruit, before we get to how to train, is one of the most powerful ways to recruit volunteers, especially in the median-sized church of 75 people, is to ask directly.
Yeah.
It's remarkably more powerful than announcements from stage. So you could actually skip the part where you do the announcement from stage. All you could do is just run these on social, run these in service. Yeah, it was a lot of work to make the video, or it was some work, but like you got to use it in multiple places. And it wasn't just like a social post that disappeared after a week. It was a recruitment tool that yielded fruit in terms of people serving in the ministry, which is so desperately needed. So it's worth the effort up front. Do the work up front.
Yes.
I know you didn't want to hear, but do the work up front. When you ask me directly, Alex comes to me directly and says, hey, how do you feel about like greeting? Did you see that video that we did of Lewis up there? I'm like, yeah, I saw it. Like now there's a commonality and I know exactly what's being asked of me. I guarantee you I am so much more likely to say yes because I'm like, one, that looked fun. Two, social pressure of Lewis is doing it. Why am I? Well, I'm just let Lewis do it and then I look like the bad guy. Three, expectations are clear. Like I'm confident that this is not going to be so bad.
Totally. And I pastor a church, the median-sized church in America, and there is a pastoral element to that, which is in a group that size, you're able to discern the gifts, not perfectly, of course, but you have a pulse of like the gifts of what people bring to the table. And so asking people directly, actually in our context of a community that size, has been pretty fruitful because I know folks who are gifted in certain areas and not gifted in others. So when we have a need, and if we do a fine job of telling the story, I can go to that person and say like, hey, I see this gift in you. Would you fill this position? Would you volunteer your time? And the success rate of making an ask like that can be pretty high, using your pastoral pulse of the people in your community.
Pastor Pulse?
Yeah, you got it.
Wow.
Put that
Okay,
in
let's
your
get to
pocket
how
for
to
later.
train. So there are 3 C's that I like to lean on. So this is a 3-part framework with an individual 3-part framework within part 2 of
Praise
the
God.
first 3-part framework. Capacity, competency, and character are the 3 C's that I consider when I'm evaluating myself as a leader, but when I'm looking at someone and I'm trying to figure out, would they be a good fit for this? Do I want them to be in this place? Do I want them to be in this place? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? Capacity, competency, and character. Here's the thing. You as a church leader, in the context of them volunteering, are responsible for the first 2. You cannot really do anything about their character. Sure. You're going to preach. You're going to try to do things in church that
Between them and the Lord.
spiritual formation, and hopefully they are being formed
Yeah.
spiritually. The first 2, capacity and competency, are your responsibility. Capacity in the sense that you don't want to overload your volunteers.
Right.
And we know that this is an epidemic within church because what do? We need volunteers, but we have 7. So this is how much needs to be done, and this is how many people there are, and put 1 and 1 together, and hey, it's not adding
the
up.
maths are not mathing.
That's correct. Story of how I got started. So when I first started volunteering in church, in Bible college, it was in the media director department. And this eventually parlayed itself into becoming the media director. And this was a part-time job. I was in Bible college. Like I was on staff, quote unquote, but like, was I really on staff? So it was kind of like this like elevated volunteer role, but it started as, purely volunteer. And for me, at least, I considered myself to be like a high capacity volunteer. And so for me, what my pastor recognized was like, he was going to give me a challenge, and he trusted me that I could like sort it out. And so the first thing that he gave me, I like proved myself to do it. And then I came out of that feeling like, oh, I have the competency in this. And what it did was it gave me the faith and the belief in myself that the next thing, which was a little bit harder, so well, if I figured out the first thing, I can figure out the second thing. Now, that's me. I would say the high capacity volunteer in the church is rare. and unusual. And eventually, like, I was getting paid. And so that's not going to be realistic for most volunteers either.
Right.
Most volunteers are going to end up being like the first employee at our company, Mitch. Mitch is like an ox. And Mitch is like an ox because you can basically just like hook him up and then just say, go, Mitch. And Mitch goes, all right. And he just goes in a circle and a circle and a circle forever. There's this memorable scene from Parks and Rec where Jerry is licking these envelopes to send out for this political campaign. And he licks and stamps like 200 envelopes, and he's just having the best time doing this like menial work. And he's just like, la 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 la. And everyone else is kind of like laboring through the task, but he's like, this is just great. At a certain point, someone points out to him like he did it all wrong. He's like, oh, okay, time to start again. And he just like goes through it all over again because like he's just like this person that just does the work. For those people, they're not usually the types. Now, Mitch has really grown into this over 10 years, and that just shows you like the ability.
His character.
Wow, exactly. At the start, what I did for Mitch was I took what I knew how to do and I gave him a foolproof system. And this is, I think, the best way to train people, because what it does is it builds the feeling of competency within themselves because you gave them this foolproof system to follow. And so then they've done it, they come out of it and they feel good about themselves, which means they're more likely to do the job better. Yeah. They're more likely to do the job well. And case in point, Mitch, as a perfect example, and me starting as that media director, every time you introduce something new, you can give it to them that's a bit more challenging and a bit more challenging. And then eventually they're doing things where they're combining different skills because you've kind of created different systems. And now they're basically filling in the gaps on their own. And now they're becoming that high capacity volunteer. These fail-proof systems, to be clear, we just like write them in Google Docs. What I did was I had learned how to do video announcements as a media director. And then I was like, I need someone else to edit. Mitch, you will now edit video announcements. And I gave him 52 steps. It was the first system I'd ever written. It was 52 steps in a Google Doc. And I was like, follow these steps, Mitch. Nowadays we can use Loom for this. And there's actually like screen records. Back then it was just screen grabs with like written instructions. And he did it once and I looked at it and I was like, okay, this step you misinterpreted like this step I should have written that differently, I meant this. And then he's like, great, okay. And now he could do it again and again and again.
Yeah, and like you said, when a new volunteer, a new recruit has that success because you've done the work up front as a recruiter, as the staff member, the pastor, the team leader, whatever, they will inevitably feel the the satisfaction, the affirmation of completing the task, learning a new task, and hopefully get excited by the fact that they've learned a new skill, they are doing new work, and ideally, and we've seen it happen in this office repeatedly, end up going above and beyond in their role, taking ownership of it because you've created a framework for them to succeed, taking ownership and then taking that role beyond where anyone has ever taken it before. That, in my estimation, is like the ideal situation. And we've seen it play out enough times within this framework that like it's not just possible, it's pretty plausible that when you put people in the right circumstances, the right environment to succeed, they will feel so satisfied in that work that they will very likely end up taking it above and beyond. I can think of somebody in our church, the guy who runs ProPresenter, as the perfect example, where I didn't even do a good enough job in this area to like set him up for success, but we worked through it together to the point where like he had what we like to call core competency, and now he's doing stuff with ProPresenter that like is way beyond my purview, and I love it that way because I don't need to know. Because the next person that's going to come up to do ProPresenter, I'm not going to train. He's going to train. And they're going to be 2 steps beyond, or two full steps, 2 leaps beyond where James ever even started. And so I think that's kind of the ideal situation, but it all does begin, like you said, and kind of what we're advocating for here in this episode is doing the legwork up front.
And the exercise that you want to practice with every person that you are responsible for in terms of volunteer, whether you're the lead pastor and you're responsible for everyone, or you're an executive pastor or a youth pastor, I'm just responsible for my youth leaders, is consider those 3 C's. First, evaluate yourself and think about how you're doing on capacity, competency, and character. And then think about each volunteer and run through each of those 3 C's. So start with capacity. Okay, how much work is this person doing? Are they ready for a bit more, or should I give them a bit less? You know, this is the curse of the high capacity volunteer and the paradox, which is like the more you prove yourself in places like church where we are in desperate need of volunteers,
the more you're going to get.
Exactly. And then eventually you're like, I'm I'm doing too much. My competency outpaced my capacity, and now my character is lagging because I'm bitter at everyone, right? And that's why what's cool, but also just a little strange. But these 3 C's is that they all kind of work together, and so you need to be mindful of how all 3 are affecting your volunteers, how all 3 are affecting yourself. So capacity: should I be adding more? Should I be removing? Competency: is this person on a positive trajectory, right? Like Alex had to train that individual in the basics of ProPresenter, and then they kind of took ownership and started doing more and more themselves. It's kind of an interesting, if you think about a line, this is more work before things get easier, right? So like you are able to do something, so the line is flat, and then you train someone else, and invariably at the beginning they're not as good as you. So like the quality goes down a bit, and then it starts to creep back up, and it eventually reaches the original level that you were at, and then in the ideal, it then surpasses what you were ever able to do. And so you kind of have to get through that lull to then get to the other side where things actually get a lot better. And so how are you evaluating competency? And then finally, character. This is really just thinking about how someone is growing. It's being mindful of how they're affecting the other people near them. And are there any issues that you need to be talking about? Because yes, it's not your responsibility for someone's character, but it does become your responsibility when their character is affecting other people around them. Yeah. And now you have to consider about the interplay between the different people on the team. And frankly, this is like one of the least fun parts of a job of being a leader. And I'll point you to the podcast episode that we did at the beginning of this year, 2024, where we talked about our non-negotiable values. Because values are how we kind of monitor and work with character issues in our own organizations. Like, hey, here are the expectations. Here is who we strive and aspire to be. And when people are not kind of leaning into that, I usually don't go to our team and I go, you're disappointing me. I say, you're disappointing the people around you. And because we're in a paid setting, you can take certain, approaches that may be necessary to avoid in church. But those 3 C's: continually evaluate. And this gets us to the celebration. This is the part that I think most churches just never even get to. It's just hard enough to get volunteers. It's hard enough to put them in a place where they're actually can help and they're serving and everything's fine and there's not conflict. And celebrating is how you keep volunteers for the long term. And it's the same 3 C's: capacity, competency, and character. You celebrate a volunteer by going to them and asking them about how they're feeling with the amount of workload that they have. You celebrate them by acknowledging that, hey, we really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate it so much that I want to hear, are you taking on too many Sundays right now? Or do you feel like I can challenge you to do a little bit more? And just by taking the step and asking them about that, you're celebrating them because they're being acknowledged and their efforts are not being overlooked.
That's right.
You can also then go to competency and celebrate every time they do something well. The ProPresenter volunteer at Alex's church, who's now doing transitions that Alex didn't even know were loaded into ProPresenter because he hasn't looked in ProPresenter in a couple of years. Every time you see something good, go out of your way to acknowledge it. This happened the other day in our organization. A person had really succeeded in something, and so we did this fun little thing. It was on Pro Church Tools Inc. Same episode as before, where we gave him the wrestling belt, and we're like, hey, the Q3 wrestling belt goes to Kyle because he's really taken this initiative that I didn't ask of him, but he took, and so we want to acknowledge this competency and this willingness to step up. It can be public, it can be private, and kind of know people. I felt okay, in this case, I think a public thing is appropriate, and I think everyone loves it. Sometimes it's a private thing, and people appreciate that even more, depending on the person. And then finally, character. Again, acknowledge and give credit where it's due. Anytime someone does something that's praiseworthy, anytime someone shows the fruit of the Spirit, and this is distinct from competency. It's 100% distinct, right?
It's what you do and who you are.
Yeah. There's what you do and how you do it. And so acknowledging, hey, there's just integrity, and oftentimes this celebration can come in a difficult time, right? It's hey, I saw that this happened and it was challenging, but you did it in such a way that I wanted to acknowledge that was with integrity, that was with grace, that was with empathy.
Yeah, and this is not unique to leading a volunteer team. This is something that comes up in just any sort of interpersonal relationship. For anyone who has a romantic partnership, this comes up all the time in the area of having expectations of what you do in the house. And when your partner meets those expectations, over time, you just like kind of stop thanking them for doing the thing, like whether it's like making the bed or I don't know, bringing you a glass of water tonight or something. It's like, well, yeah, I expected you to do that. So you just over time, there's a tendency to stop thanking them for that. And then that just breeds all sorts of issues. And so in the context of like leading a volunteer team, you know, again, I bring it up often just because it's the context that I pastor in, but like we're a small church and we don't have as many volunteers as we'd like to have. Like James, who runs ProPresenters, is a perfect example. Right now we have one person who runs ProPresenters. Like James is behind the computer every week. And I don't have much to offer James. I don't have a break to offer him. I can't lavish him with gifts. You know, we do the Christmas gifts for our volunteers every year, but like I can't lavish him with gifts. What I can do is like at the very least once a month or like better every time he volunteers, thank him intentionally. Like just go out of my way to like thank him and be on the lookout for opportunities to celebrate him, to praise him. And that will go so far relationally. And I'm convinced it will go far, like as far as the energy that he has to show up every Sunday and do the thing. If his work is not going unnoticed, if I go out of my way as a team leader, as a pastor, as a volunteer leader, whatever, to call that out and acknowledge him, even when he's just meeting expectations, when he's just like, we have a Sunday where there's like, he just nails everything. It's like, well, yeah, like James does that. Well, no, like go out of my way to celebrate that, to acknowledge it, to thank him. I'm convinced that'll go a long way.
Right, and we talked about the relationship between these 3 C's: character, competency, capacity. If you know, so okay, capacity-wise, I can't really do much, and you know, I can't really like give him gifts. So, okay, if one of them is like in a tough spot, then you can overdo, like go harder on the other one to kind of make up for it. That's a really great point, I think, as well to point out.
It's tough. Recruiting volunteers, it's tough, and it is an evergreen challenge before us. There's always stuff to do. It feels like there's never enough people to do it. But I really do think that, and you know, we joked about it at the top of the show, but like by maybe writing some of this stuff down or like putting it in a doc and like sitting down with your team leaders and saying like, hey, we need a little more help, or we think there's people in the room who want to volunteer, but we haven't built that bridge for them to get on board. Like, let's build this framework and get more people integrated, because we talk about it all the time. It takes a village, or church's community, or all this stuff. But like most people who show up on Sunday just have never put their hands to doing some work in church. Like we want to build a bridge to give people that opportunity. Writing some of this stuff down, having a framework, having a policy could really go a long way to, you know, bolstering your volunteer teams, so increasing the capacity for all your existing teams, but also giving folks in your church, maybe who want to volunteer, but who have never been asked, the opportunity to get involved and put their faith into action.
Yeah, and sometimes just asking is the final thing to get past the excuse that we all kind of tell ourselves internally. The last thing we want is for an episode like this to heap one extra task on top of a weary pastor. And so the best way to think about this entire process, which is how we kicked off this episode, is think about it like finances. It never feels good to save because like we want to spend, and then also like we have to spend. But if you are disciplined to do that extra bit up front, what it does is eventually those savings start to like pay dividends, and then the dividends earn savings on top of the savings, and the miracle of compound interest begins to take place. And compound interest works in finances and savings. It also works with culture. So as you begin to build culture, it's like you're pushing this snowball, you're pushing this rock up a hill. You're pushing it up a hill. It's like every step, it's like I'm laboring with every single step. But then eventually you get to the other side of the hill, and now the rock starts rolling down itself, and you're not pushing it. And that's the compound interest of culture, because you've built this culture, and eventually it gets to this point where you had to do all this work laying the foundation up front, but that's not indefinite. And that's like what I want to encourage you with. The most healthy churches in terms of volunteers and in terms of culture have done the hard work up front, and then you reap the harvest and the benefits down the line because of this compound interest that culture kind of keeps building upon itself. And at that point, all you're kind of doing is maintenance. And now, ideally, you also have all these departments that are thriving, people that are serving and being spiritually formed because they are active in community. They're not just consumers sitting in the pews, but they're actually reaching out and serving and making a difference in the church, which is actually forming them more spiritually than it ever would just hear a sermon and just raise hands during music and just sing to the worship. So yes, it's work, but like most things, if you do the work up front, it's so worth it on the other side.
That's right.
And we'll see you on the other side next Wednesday. Thanks for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk to you then. I'm just a little out of my rhythm right now. I got this trip coming up, and then I keep eating too much. And if I just don't eat right, it's like, what's the point?
It's really hard to eat right.
Everyone has birthdays.
And food is just great,
Well, that's also true.
right?
But 10% body fat. That's got to be great, right? Surely that's great.
I have no context for that.
I want to get to it once. You just get to it once. And, I've heard it said, no food tastes as good as looking good feels. It's something like that. No food tastes as good as feeling good tastes. Man,
Right.
It was so profound when I heard
Yeah.
it. This is not a good
No,
version.
but it makes sense. Because I'll go through seasons of like, oh, I'm gonna live while I'm alive. I'm gonna eat. I'm gonna
Yeah.
and it's not like crappy food. It's just like,
no, it's like actually just
Yeah.
the best food.
but then a couple months of that and you're like, I kind of hate myself.
There's a bit of that.